As we turn and get into the book of Deuteronomy, I think every year I get gerfuffled because there's so much to talk about, and it's very difficult for me to focus myself on one thing. But I'm going to try to look in the direction that our traditions have taken us, because here we are in summer, and this time in summer, our reading cycle that we do turns our heads towards the high holidays, which are actually only 8 weeks away. It's amazing to think. And starting 2 Shabbatot ago, 2 Saturdays ago, the readings took us to begin 10 special Haftorah portions. The first 3 are known as Haftorot Shel Tochacha, the Haftorahs of rebuke, followed by the Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 Haftorahs of consolation. The first 2 come out of the book of Jeremiah, and the remaining 8 after that all come out of the book of Isaiah. So as we approach the high holidays, there's this incredibly rich reading cycle that we have of digging not only in Deuteronomy, Moses' masterpiece, but also one of the greatest prophets of Israel, Isaiah, in his words. It's a remarkable time of the year. So today is the last day. It's the third one of the Sabbaths of Tochacha, the Sabbath of rebuke. And it's called Shabbat Chazzon, the Sabbath of vision. And that's because the Haftarah reading is from Isaiah chapter 1, which begins, Chazzon Yeshiyahu ben Amoz asher Yehuda veYerushalayim. The Chazzon, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, concerning Judah and Jerusalem. This 10-week period is a time of studying what the words of the prophets speak. As we approach Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, they're intended to challenge us to consider what's in our hearts as we approach that time. The prophets who wrote books, there were many prophets, but there were only some who wrote books. The prophets who wrote books, I've always considered them to be like master oil painters. Their poetic grammar is like the brushes skillfully wielded. Their words are like the individual masterful strokes of a painting. And if the prophets are master painters, then their works are masterpieces. And most of these works, like those of Jeremiah and Isaiah, focus the subject of their masterpiece is this great tragedy, the loss of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the exile of God's chosen people. But within their masterpieces, whose subject is that, these masterpieces of Hebrew poetry have images within them surrounding this whole thing. Images that are scenes of glorious comfort. So the painting itself includes rebuke and great comfort. That's what these texts give for us. They give us comfort. They give us pure hope. They reveal to us steadfast, true promises of the restoration of Jerusalem, of the regathering of Israel, and of the rebuilding of the house of God. These masterworks of poetic art paint a picture of the certainty of God's promises, the certainty of the regathering, and the certainty of the drawing into a covenantal relationship all the families of the nations of the earth. The weeks of rebuke and the weeks of comfort don't ask us to focus on the what and the specifics of the tragedy, so much as they challenge us to consider the why of the tragedy. How did we get to this place? Our lessons from these weeks will ask us to consider what it is that God desires of us and how we respond to what he asks of us. The master Hebrew poets use both sharp words and kind phrases to stimulate us towards one thing, and that is teshuvah, repentance, and to align our hearts with God. Isaiah's career was characterized by receiving prophetic vision from God and then confronting the wayward leadership of God's chosen people to warn them, and if possible, to cause them to repent. The first two haftarot of the weeks of rebuke came from the writings of Jeremiah, as I said. He was also called to rebuke and to encourage both the wayward leadership of Israel and the leadership of the surrounding nations. Jeremiah was a mere child when he was called, but he would come to be known by a few monikers. One of them is the prophet to the nations, and the other is the weeping prophet. The former name arising from his God-given assignment, which is declared in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10. See, today I have appointed you over nations and over kingdoms, to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and to overthrow, and to build and plant. And the latter epithet, the weeping prophet, comes because of his own words, which are found in Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 1. Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. This is what is underneath the prophets. Thank you. I kind of need the lights to read. This is the motivation of the prophets. I think that summarizes it. To destroy and overthrow and to build and plant. There's a twofold nature to it. This year, Shabbat Chazzon falls on the Sabbath that we enter Deuteronomy, the fifth book, Devarim, the fifth book of the Torah. Devarim is a very unique book. It represents Moshe expounding or making clear the words of the Torah, all that time that he spent with God. It's all spoken over the course of the last 6 weeks of Moshe's 120 years of existence. We must recognize the text as exceptionally profound, as it represents the height of the wisdom of Moshe, who was no ordinary man. Remember that he regularly sat in the cloud of glory, conversing directly with God. As it said back in the time of the Korah rebellion, you can find this in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6 through 8. It says, "Hear my words," he said. "When there is a prophet of Adonai, I reveal myself in vision. I speak to him in a dream." You see, that's what happens with Isaiah. "Not so with my servant Moshe. In all my house he is faithful. I speak with him face to face, plainly, and not in riddles. He even looks at the form of Adonai. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe?" See, Moshe was very unique. And of course, Devarim promises that God will continue to bring prophets to give his words directly to Israel. That's found in Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 19. "I will raise up a prophet like you for them from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. Now, whoever does not listen to my words that this prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account." And he did send many prophets. And while they were all righteous and chosen and obedient to God and blessed to receive visions and dreams, nevertheless, even the great ones like Isaiah and Jeremiah did not measure up to Moshe. But peculiarly, the words that I just read to you speak of a singular prophet, one prophet, who is like Moshe, who spoke, the Hebrew literally says pe el pe, which means mouth to mouth, actually, with God. This, of course, we know as Yeshua, the prophet like Moshe. He told Thomas this, it's captured in John chapter 14, verses 10 to 11. Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father dwelling in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe because of the works themselves. See, while Moshe spoke to God pe el pe, mouth to mouth, in the cloud of glory, Yeshua spoke God's words directly because God dwelt in him and he dwelt in the Father. Those who know him know the Father. That is a great mystery when you consider that. A great mystery and a great stumbling block to some. How can God appear in the form of a man? Be that as it will. So this week we consider the meaning of Shabbat Chazzon through these great witnesses. The great prophet Isaiah, who did indeed receive revelation in visions, in Chazzon, paired with Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, who spoke with God pe el pe. And we, of course, hold them together with the teaching of Yeshua Meshikenu, Yeshua our Messiah, who came from God and dwelt with God because God dwelt within him. Yeshua was as if a manifestation of the tent of meeting, if you will, where his disciples were elevated to the level of Moshe, speaking with God pe el pe through Yeshua, who said, "Those who have seen me have seen the Father." Again, this great mystery. And it's a mystery that is wonderful to wrestle with. And what is the core message of all these witnesses? Moshe, Isaiah, and Yeshua. It might actually be best to first ask this question: why do we even have these witnesses in the first place? All of these witnesses did the exact same thing, which is the theme of the 10 weeks leading up to Rosh Hashanah. They all both rebuked and comforted. They all warned and rebuked leadership, whether of Israel or of the nations. They all comforted the lowly and promised a future of great glory and shalom. They all declared that obedience to what God has in his heart comes with a great reward. But negligence of what is dear to God comes with sudden and great disaster. I will venture to say this. Why do we have these witnesses? Well, he sent all these witnesses, to quote Weston, because he loves us. That's why he sent them. He loves us so much as to have expectations of us. You know, that's a sign of a fatherly love. If you love someone enough to have high expectations of them because they're worth it. And what's the core message? Which is to say, what is God's expectation of us? Again, I'll venture to say the core message is that we who are in covenant with God are supposed to do our level best to live with each other in a just society. Amen? Elsewhere in Deuteronomy it says, Tzaddik, tzaddik tirdof, justice, justice you shall seek. That is what he put us here for. He created mankind to be stewards of his precious creation. As it is written, Adonai Elohim took the man and placed him in the garden, la'avda ul shamra, to serve and to guard. That was man's purpose, and still is. Serve and guard are the tasks of a steward. We are to be stewards. This is the driving motivation for God's people. If you're adopted into God's family, he loves you so much as to have this expectation of you. He wouldn't have adopted you into it if you couldn't. And the way one is able to properly serve and guard is to live according to God's instruction. That word instruction is Torah. His Torah teaches self-control and selflessness. His Torah teaches us to limit ourselves so that we can live according to him, because he limits himself so that we can live. It teaches humility and mercy. It teaches forgiveness and renewal. It teaches us to consider others more important than ourselves. When God's people strayed from these foundational principles, God sent his servants, the prophets, like Isaiah and all of them, and ultimately Yeshua, to admonish and to redirect and to comfort them. Let's look at the common themes of Moses, Isaiah, and Yeshua. First of all, was Moshe, through Moshe, that we see the establishment of the responsibility of leaders in Israel. It's Moshe that first taught Israel that God has expectations of leadership. Deuteronomy 1:9 through 18 recalls the establishment of the Sanhedrin, composed of what it says, tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens, and also shotrim, enforcers. Your translations might say magistrates of the tribes. These are shoftim and shotrim, judges and enforcers. Thus, Moshe established the civil authority structure of Israel, which was intended to help build the just society that God expects. Judgment and enforcement are all part of a social structure that is based on the rule of law. In this case, the laws are to be based on God's Torah. God established through the hand of Moshe the system of justice that is to be the model of the whole world. And remember when things went bad, like it says in the book of Judges, in that day, every man did as he pleased. That's when the problems arise. But God set up this idea of leadership, of judges and magistrates, in order that we would limit ourselves and live by the rule of law. It was necessary that they had to have a justice system in place before they entered into the land to take possession of it. The land that was promised to the fathers, because on that land was to be built the just society that was to be the model for the whole earth. In this opening section of Deuteronomy, that Moshe reminded them about the first test of leadership. As you read down through this, then it comes to the incident that we call the spies. And if you will remember my teaching on that, the text doesn't say spy at all. It says tourists. They were supposed to be tourists, but they thought they were going in to be military spies, and so they missed the point. The leaders approaching it with the wrong understanding failed the test, and it resulted in disaster. It extended their sojourn in the wilderness by 38 years until all the males of military age were dead. For the rest of the Torah portion, Moshe chose to give a brief sketch of the journey to the land, which actually talks about another responsibility of leaders, international relations. Does that sound relevant to today? On this journey, God required them to keep peace with certain people, the descendants of Esau and Lot, who were important relatives, and to conquer others, Sihon and Og, those who opposed God's will. The test of leadership went well, and they were on the precipice of reward, possessing the land, just on the edge of it. Isaiah addressed the issue of failing leadership. Through the prophet, God says this in Isaiah 1, verse 10. Hear the word of Adonai, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the Torah of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Comparing the leadership to those of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's the lesson of that? Watch out, or you might get burned with fire and brimstone. Then he states plainly in verse 23, your princes are rebellious and friends with thieves. The international relations were not going well at the time that Isaiah spoke. What's their primary crime, though? This is really their primary crime. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with international relations. It says in verse 23, everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan, nor does a widow's case ever come to them. You see what they're being rebuked for? For not taking care of the most vulnerable in society. Isaiah will admonish the leadership for how they allowed foreign ideas to corrupt God's society. That's how the international relations went bad. They allowed the neighboring ideals to come in. They will take on the practices of the places around them. They will acquire all the elements of power from foreign nations, trusting in horses and gold and wealth and power, but forgetting their calling to be a nation which relies on God and God alone, and a nation which provides for the most vulnerable members of society. Isaiah's words point to the leadership's crimes of corruption and injustice towards what Yeshua called the least of these, my brothers. This is Isaiah's emphasis. At the time of Isaiah, the leadership of Israel during the late First Temple period had given themselves over to the corrupting influence of seeking connection with corrupt pagan nations that surrounded them. And in so doing, they absorbed their practices and their immorality, including the mistreatment of the most vulnerable and the seeking of nothing but power and wealth. Turning now to Yeshua, who came in the last decades of the Second Temple period, he found similar issues. The society that he dwelt in was under the thumb of Roman leaders and walked a balance, a tightrope of appeasing Rome while trying to keep Jewish tradition alive. Yeshua found a priesthood that had been compromised. He found a king that was illegitimate. And the majority of individual rulers in the Sanhedrin, the governing body, the house of judges, who our text calls scribes and Pharisees, he considered the majority of the leadership of that to be hypocrites. A term that the Talmud confirms is actually the worst failure that a Pharisee could commit. There are 7 kinds of Pharisees, and the worst kind, it says, is hypocrites. So just like Isaiah, Yeshua engaged with those that he saw as failing at their task of leadership of God's Am Segulah, God's treasured people. A huge proportion of Yeshua's ministry on earth was, just as the prophets before him, focused on rebuking Israel's leadership. Matthew chapter 23 is a chapter that is entirely dedicated to Yeshua's rebuke of Israel's leadership. It begins with him speaking to crowds, and it has this repeating phrase, "Woe to you." It begins with him speaking to the crowd saying, "The scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves on the chair of Moshe. Therefore, All that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say and they do not do. They speak a good line, but they don't do it themselves. That's the hypocrites. He's clearly saying that the leadership of his time has taken up the authority of Moshe, and he advises the crowd to respect that authority. But he critiques their leadership because these particular leaders made rulings that they did not live by. He then gives a God principle regarding leadership. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Again, another text found in the Talmud. Isaiah had also spoken similarly in chapter 2, verse 11, when he said, man's haughty look shall be brought low, and the pride of man shall be humbled. See, Yeshua and Isaiah are dealing with the same issues. Matthew 23 includes a long list of the 7 woes, which actually in the Hebrew are the 7 oys. I'm not kidding, oys. Oy to you, scribes and Pharisees. To this haughty, hypocritical leadership that sat itself in the chair of Moshe without considering how important it is to be humble like Moshe. Remember, he was the most humble man that ever lived. So if you're going to sit in his chair, you better be humble too. For our purposes today and for the sake of time, I'll only draw your attention to one of the woes. Matthew 23:14. Woe to you, oy to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive a greater condemnation. Just as the opening chapters of Isaiah emphasize the rights of widows and orphans, so too does Yeshua point that out to the leadership of the Am Segulah. But his greatest criticism he saved for the parable. There's a parable in Matthew chapter 21 of the landowner that planted a vineyard, speaking directly to the hypocritical scribes and certain of the leadership of the Pharisees. Chapter 21, verse 33 begins this way. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. Yeshua developed this parable. For the sake of time, I won't read it to you entirely. Yeshua developed this parable to describe that at the time for harvest approached, the owner sent servants or slaves to the vine growers to receive the produce of his vineyard. And the growers beat, killed one, and stoned another. This happened also with the second group of servants, beat them, killed them, stoned them. Then the owner sent his son, and they killed him because they wanted to take the vineyard from the heir. Yeshua then asked his audience what they think the owner will do, and they replied, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the seasons. The group of leaders of Israel that he confronted then at that moment understood that he was talking about them. Here's the interesting thing that I find about Yeshua's use of this parable. He is actually once again hearkening back to the words of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 5. This is, if you have a homework assignment, you might want to do this. Compare Yeshua's vineyard parable to Isaiah chapter 5. It begins, let me sing a song for my beloved, a song of my beloved about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it out and cleared its stones, planted it with a choice vine, built a tower in the midst of it, and even cut out a winepress. He expected it to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes. So now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done? Why then, when I expected it to yield good grapes, did it yield worthless grapes? Once again, the prophet like Moshe is sounding a great deal like the prophet Isaiah, isn't he? And that's no accident, not an accident at all. The author of the Gospels is making all the connections to bring forth the teaching which is from long ago. God expects the leaders to lead his people justly. The vineyard is a reference to Jerusalem, which sits on a fertile hill, surrounded by a wall and with a very tall building, the temple, which stands like a tower in its midst. Yeshua focused on the vine growers as temporary tenants. Isaiah on the fruit produced in the vineyard. Both warn of the wrath of God towards God, who is the vineyard owner. Jerusalem is to be the place which is God's vineyard that is intended to spread justice in the world. We sang the song, right? The law will go forth. Any nation, country, or empire, or group of people that wishes to build a society that is blessed by God must necessarily gain its sustenance and its source from Jerusalem, from the God of Jerusalem. Yeshua expanded on Isaiah's vineyard and vine dresser imagery in one of his greatest teachings, which is found in the Good News written by Yochanan, the book of John. John 15 declares, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Remain in me and I in you, just as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, but must remain in the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him bears much fruit, for apart from me, you can do nothing. See the profound nature of it? At least part of the beauty of using a grapevine as an analogy for living according to God's will is that a vine spreads and expands out from its source, doesn't it? This in part is why Isaiah and Yeshua use this analogy, because as Isaiah said in chapter 2, and as we sang in the song, the Torah will go forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now the vine and the branches is not to be confused with Paul's olive tree and grafted in branches. I want to make that as a sideline. These are talking about two different things. They serve different purposes. The vine and the branches teach how justice, mercy, and truth must come through the nourishing channel of Yeshua, who will take his seat on the throne of David in God's holy city. Paul's olive tree and the grafting in of those branches speaks of how the nations are grafted into the covenant family of God. The tree of Israel and the vine of Yeshua are teaching two different things. I just want to make that clear. If we want to build a just and merciful and faithful society, we must remain directly connected to Yeshua, the true vine. We must allow him to prune us and dress us so that we might produce much fruit. For that fruit comes from him. You know, it occurs to me as I was reading through this, Isaiah asked in chapter 5, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done? Well, what was more was to actually send his son. his Son to become the true vine. That's the answer to that. The fruit that we can bear, we can actually turn to Paul for that. Paul spoke of that in Galatians, right? You all know these. What is the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and faithfulness. We live that way, connected to Yeshua, sustained by his good sap that flows through us, by the Spirit that flows through us. And we produce those fruits, and then we are able to live in a just society. Let us live our lives, then, with the following attitude. How can I, ask yourself this, how can I, this day, today, how can I bring forth one of these fruits? Ask for God's help in that today and every day. Bring forth good fruit. Ask him to help you as a branch connected on the vine of Yeshua. Ask him each and every day to help you bring forth good fruit. And ask him to prune away any dead twig that's holding you back from that. That's what Yeshua's role is for us. I'll finish this with Yeshua's own words. He said in his true vine teaching, John chapter 15, verse 7, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Amen.